Welcome to Clinical Perspectives, the podcast where we explore the real challenges, insights, and decisions shaping the medical device industry. I'm your host, Stephanie Stover, and each episode I speak with leaders, innovators, and experts across medtech to uncover what actually drives product success, regulatory strategy, and commercial growth. If you work in the medical device industry, healthcare technology, or life sciences, this show is for you. Today I'm joined by Clay Johnson, head of sales at New World Medical, accomplished executive sales leader in pharmaceuticals, medical device sales, surgical, and has an incredibly broad experience building large new teams and turning around underperforming ones. Great to have you on the show, Clay.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Glad to be here.
So today we're going to be talking about leading in a regulated industry without killing innovation. So you mentioned that you've worked across the military, pharmaceuticals, and a wide number of industries, all highly regulated. How do those experiences shape how you think about innovation today?
It certainly has affected how I think about it. It's changed a lot over the years. Having joined the pharmaceutical industry in the early 90s, it wasn't quite as regulated as it is now. And it was certainly a process to see more and more regulation, which quite honestly was needed at the time. And then I've also been with a couple of companies that were under DOJ investigations, settlements. So I've been in some pretty regulated times where you felt like your hands were tied quite a bit. And then probably as you move towards device and the smaller companies, the regulations persist, but they become less onerous and less oversight. With the big companies, you have very large, obviously, legal departments, a lot of oversight. You're worried about what kind of emails you're even sending internally. I used to have to go. It was interesting. The legal department would give me 30 days and say, listen, if you want to do a wrap up slide, show us your slides, all your slides, and then we'll get back to you. And so it'd be 30 days ahead of time. On the 29th day, you usually got it back redlined. And so I realized I had to change something I was doing. So literally I would just make my slides very broad. And I wouldn't mention product names, wouldn't make any claims. And so it was just a way to navigate and keep the momentum going and not let some of the oversight really slow you down. I'm sure there's other ways in other departments. For me, I was in sales and marketing. And it was fairly easy to do, but it took me a while. It took me a couple of years of dealing with the 30 days ahead of time and then having to fix it the day before the meeting.
So actually, that transitions perfectly into my next question. I was going to ask, when people hear the term regulated industry, they often assume innovation has to slow down. Why do you think that belief persists even today?
Yeah, because when you say that, your statement that most people feel that, as it gets more regulated, innovation slows down. I could see why they say that. It's just because communicating becomes so difficult.
Mm,
But I guess aside from that, I'm not, except for the changing standards maybe that the FDA might have, I don't really see that as directly opposite of what I think you can still innovate. And it sort of depends on the path you take. For example, the company I work with, and a couple in the same industry, especially surgical device, they go through the 510K pathway. So they find a predicate device, they create something like that. It basically goes out on the market without much labeling. And so
mhm,
they call that guerrilla marketing. You kind of send it out there, you put it in the surgeon's hands. Most of the stuff the surgeon uses are indicated for what they use it for anyway. Then, of course, after a while, the surgeons get experience with it. You innovate, you adjust it based on the surgeon's feedback, and then you produce data
mhm.
afterwards. That's the more innovative pathway. The harder pathway is, I think, what they call an IDE, where you have to do a large study up front. It's more similar to like what a pharmaceutical would have to do. They have to go through phase 1, 2, and 3 trials before they
Mhm.
head out. So I guess I gave you a little bit of a conflicting answer. It kind of does, and it kind of. I guess I'm not willing to accept the cop out that the regulations is always going to slow down innovation. It's going to make it a little bit more challenging. But I think, like I made that simple example up front, I think if you keep your head about you and think of a smart way through it, you could probably find a smart way through it.
Can you do you have any examples off the top of your head that you can think of where that's been true for you or perhaps for a company that you worked with?
Yeah, I think the company I'm with right now, the last three have been gone through that pathway. where they find a predicate device, they 510K, they put it out on the market, and they actually end up changing the device just minimally. They put it in a
Mm.
surgeon's hands. For example, one device, it was blocking the view. The finger was blocking the view because the cannula
Oh.
was too short. So they lengthened the cannula. Pressing the button was too difficult. It was create too much up and down pressure. So obviously our engineers went back and they changed the button. And that change wasn't enough to cause any really significant regulatory filings with the EA. It's just enough to make a small change to it where we could adapt. And right now, that device is much better accepted now because of the changes. And they continue to make changes on small changes like that.
Hmm. Okay. Um, where do leaders most commonly confuse regulation with, say, restriction?
I would, it's, well, there are going to be extra hurdles and extra communication. Like you can be very careful how you communicate, even internal communications. I think the filings always change. It can change. The one thing that I think most people don't realize, well, I think they do. They just don't think about it. Is the FDA and these regulatory bodies are not all they strive to be consistent, but they're not necessarily consistent because they're just groups of human beings making decisions.
Hmm.
And, you know, the FDA doesn't get a rewarded for moving too fast. They're just
Mm.
at risk. So I understand from their perspective. I think it's more so industry needs to remember that. I think they do remember that, but I hear a lot of frustration. The FDA did this or they made us do that. And I'm like, well, if you understand what the FDA is actually trying to do, you kind of understand why. Like if there's a
Hmm.
one unturned, they're going to want you to turn it over in the
Yeah.
file.
So, how do strong leaders create space for innovation without creating that risk?
Well, I think you know, from an enterprise-wide standpoint, I think you have to strike the right balance of delegating and staying in touch. And that's the hard part all the time. If everything takes an approval of a committee or certain people or everybody has to make a joint decision, it slows things down, but you can make stepwise decisions, directional decisions. Most of the reading you suggest that most executives should be able to make a decision with 65% of the information.
Mm.
95% or 100%. Well, I don't know if that's really a decision. That's a conclusion.
Hmm.
Of course, we'd like to wait around for the best information we can, but we don't always have the luxury of that time. So I think you make a basic decision with 65% of the information, but also get ready to change that decision pretty quickly if something changes. The problem I see is you get a bottleneck. You get 95% of the information, you wait, you make a decision, it's still not the right one. And so you've wasted all that time. So I think it's just comfort in being able to do that. And I think folks that gravitate to our line of work sometimes aren't comfortable doing that.
Hmm.
There's a lot of there's a lot of physicians, there's a lot of surgeons that work in this area, there's a lot of ophthalmologists, lot like name it, highly licensed people that are used to going through data and they like to make very accurate decisions. And so they tend to be on the more deliberate, more exact side, which is always good, except for the time. It's a really rough middle ground to find. It's usually
Hmm.
I actually think that if we're smart about it, you'd actually take a personality profile and mix them up into decision-making metrics. The highly analytical, deliberate people need to work with the people that move a little bit faster, maybe aren't
Yeah.
quite as analytical, but they go on more gut instinct. That combination is a good one
Hmm.
because I tend to be a little bit less analytical. I like to make faster decisions, but I always love to work with somebody who slows me down and who asks
Mm.
questions I may not be considering. I always think that you got to be careful with the people you match on these committees.
Yes, absolutely. Do you have some sort of, this might sound weird, but do you have some sort of criteria that you use when making important decisions as a leader?
Yeah, I think the first thing is it's an interesting question only because it's so broad, and of course you do. Can you list it? Because all the decisions you making are different. I would say that number one thing I want to make sure is this decision worth being made because we've all been in a situation. I always love it when you're in a situation. Maybe you have a group of people that are working feverishly on a topic. And you're coming with all sorts of different scenarios, and then there's always some person in the room that just quietly says, "So answer me, what are we really trying to solve here?" And then everybody just looks at him with like deer in the headlights and they're like, "Oh my God, that is the best question ever." going down this line of potentially unproductive busyness, or we're trying to fix a problem that's not really that significant, or maybe even doesn't exist. And that's just a tremendous waste of time. And so I think that combination between leadership competencies and management competencies becomes so important.
So I know that you're the head of sales at New World Medical. How do you lead your team in such a heavily regulated industry from a marketing perspective?
Yeah. I think it's a very delicate balance. You want them to be aware of it, and you wanna give them some simple rules, like, "Do this, don't do that." You wanna be able to do that, but you don't want it to feel oppressive.
Hmm.
I tell people, like, it's okay to take risks and make mistakes here as long as they're the right kinda, I call them striving errors. You were trying to do something good, right? As long as it was legal and ethical. If you overstep the bounds, we're not here to try to track you down and fire you. We are here to try to find out and correct and help you.
Mhm.
And I think that tone strikes the right balance because you could get a sales force that's scared of their shadow. It's unwilling to do anything, and clearly that's not what the company needs. They need one that can make the right decision. Also, there's different labeling for different products, and you got to make sure that people are aware of those and knowledgeable about those. Also need to make sure that, I think the one area to always be concerned about is whenever you're putting anything in writing.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
just I know I just went over some standards. I called it a Write It Right conference where I just kind of sat with the salespeople and managers and I gave them examples of how to write correspondence to a customer and how not to, and make sure that everything's above board. So I'm not sure really that answers your total question. Maybe I nibble at some of the edges of that question, but that's my basic approach. And the other part is sales. I think everybody through the pandemic got a real understanding of what it's like to work remotely. Salespeople have always worked remotely, and I always know that the real power is to lead in such a manner where you get discretionary effort, not forced compliance.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the right place to find if you can. And I'm always trying to find that right spot. I'm always trying to correct a little bit.
Hmm. So why is discretionary effort so important when launching or scaling new technology in regulated markets?
I think from just a human factor and a psychological factor, the power of choice is so incredibly important to human beings. I mean, every time I've been in a situation where somebody disagreed with me, I'm like, you can make that decision. It's your choice. So when somebody chooses to do something extra, to choose to try to make an extra call, put another program in place. They do that willingly, and it's much more powerful than me telling them they have to. Because
Yes.
now they're completely invested in it. And it's not exact, but if I had some sort of scale that could like determine the motivation, I know that it's very sensitive, that factor. I think even as you as an employee, if somebody said, "You have to do this," I'm always doing this anyway. I tell salespeople, "You can say you have to do this, or you can say I get to do that."
Yeah.
Those are 2 different viewpoints in the world, and I know if I can get myself into the "I get to do this," I'm a lot happier and I do a lot better job than if I feel forced to be compelled to do something because somebody's holding me to it. I'll even I'll even say, I'll make phrases, for example, like, I don't like the term, "I'm holding you accountable." That
Mm.
is a very punitive phrase, psychologically and otherwise. It's better to say, I would love for you to demonstrate accountability on this. That's a
Hmm.
much different way to say it. So it's one of those EQ, soft touch things that I think you have to be able to do as a sales leader to keep your team kind of rolling along.
I love that. Yeah, and it's so much more effective as well. It's effective and I don't want to say inspiring, but there's a word that I'm looking for.
Yeah, well, you always you think, okay, I'm talking to somebody 2 time zones away that sees me once a year or twice a year. And, there's no way, shape, or form if you really think about it. I can't control their behaviors. They can give me whatever title I want, VP of sales, chief commercial officer. I can try to influence their behavior. I could set up systems that they could operate in that they
Hmm.
enjoy. I really can't make them do anything. It's all their choice.
Yep.
And when you kind of think of it that way, it kind of affects the way you go about it.
So if you were advising a medical device executive who feels stuck between, say, compliance and growth, what would be your advice to them?
Well, yeah, like I said in the beginning, the feeling of between compliance and growth is accurate, but not accurate. I would say that I think if you're having that much of a struggle, I would say really getting to know your legal team, your compliance team a lot better, sitting down with them, spending time with them. It doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship. As long
Hmm.
as you can sit down and have dialogues, I'd be investing all the time in the world with the regulatory department and the CEO and anybody else who would listen because we all have a vested interest in getting this thing to market, making it successful, even the legal team.
Yeah.
Um, and that's the number one. If you can't do that, because I think the number one challenge for most executives is just making departments work together well. I think they naturally drift apart in their isolation, and they tend to get into a tribal sort of mindset. And if it's not managed, they don't cooperate. They point fingers. So it just takes a lot of management energy to make sure that they're not. I've come on board on a lot of I feel like they were rescue missions. I got hired because there was something going on with the sales team, and normally, it's never good.
Yeah.
It's like if things were good, they would have hired somebody internally. The fact that they needed somebody externally said somebody broke something along the way, and they don't have somebody to backfill it. So then you've got into a situation where it's, for lack of a boat analogy, the ship's on fire and sinking, and you got to get in there, start bailing water quickly.
Yeah.
And you got to fix a lot of things at once. It makes it awfully difficult to do that.
What are some ways that you found that are really effective in preventing teams to have that tribal mentality, or to prevent them from being too siloed?
Yeah, I think it's just communicating what you want. Like when I first came on board of the couple, I just noticed it immediately, the finger pointing. And I knew I couldn't affect the finger pointing from other departments. I could only affect it in my department. So I went to work with that. I basically said, listen, even if you feel you've been wronged or harmed or whatever, I want you to be the adult in the room.
Hmm.
You to just listen and make sure that you can only control your behavior. You can't control anybody else's behavior. And I really feel that way. But I think once you start doing that, then you start turning the corner because it actually does change things. Once you
Hmm.
can manage your own team to that level and they're not putting that out in the universe, it ends up not coming back to them quite as much.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, I suspect I know that there is a ton of finger pointing typically between sales and marketing. So being the head of both of them, I'm sure that that makes it a little bit easier to navigate that.
I'm the head of sales. We do have a head of marketing here too.
Oh, I thought. Oh, okay.
We that is a constant effort between she and I, is we know that, like, we have to get our teams working well together, and we've come a long way
Hmm.
in the last couple of years, but it's always a work in progress. I don't think it's ever fully fixed.
It's true. Shifts. Mine. Sorry. What's one mindset shift leaders need to make if they want innovation to survive in regulated industries?
If we're always believing that increased regulation is always gonna slow our progress, that's an assumption in and of itself that maybe isn't as productive as it could be. I'm not saying it won't, but walking in there with that mindset is difficult, but also realizing, yeah, there might be a little bit extra work or we might have to change the way they work, but I'm not so sure I would necessarily accept the fact that it's gonna slow
Hmm.
innovation. It might, but again, it's a mindset thing.
Right. Any last words that you would like to leave listeners with?
No, I realized the breadth and depth of the folks that may appear on this podcast, or from many other departments. There's so many different facets and sides to our industry. I know that, I'm always having to do lessons in quality. And
Mm.
that's not my line of work, but I still have to do it because I realize the complexity of what the other departments are dealing with. So I would just urge them to, and they probably already do, just learn what these other departments are doing and why. And for example, the quality department, we were having to do like all these lessons, probably about 80 of them. And their first approach was, no, everybody in the company has to do these. But I said, well, why? Even if we don't do this work, salespeople they're not in there signing quality documents. Why do they have to do that? And it probably took me a year, but I probably got 75% of those lessons removed because they
Oh,
listen.
wow. Oh,
And if
good.
you think about it, like that is, especially for a sales force to be in their office doing these lessons of what doesn't really apply to them, it really is unproductive busy work. And if
Yeah.
Take that unproductive busy work and apply it to some revenue producing activity. Now you're doing what you need to do. And I'm sure every department looks at that.
Hmm.
You know, what is the main thing you do? What are you supposed to get accomplished and make sure you're focusing on that? Any other distraction? I know it's not a, I'm not going to live in this world where there's not going to be any distractions, but just do your work to minimize that, to keep them focused on what they need to do. Cause I know that if I pull my salespeople out of the field, if I make them do some work that's not related to producing revenue, that's really not what they're built for. So I need to minimize that and maximize the other.
Yeah. And nobody's really going to benefit from that if they do those non-revenue producing things, because the company's not going to be making more money, and the salesperson is going to be discouraged and frustrated.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because they know better than most when they're wasting their time. So
Yeah.
any I just try to protect them from as much minutia as I can.
Awesome. Where can listeners find you if they want to contact you or learn more about your company?
Yeah, they can just hit me up on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Well, thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You can find Clay on LinkedIn at Clay Johnson, and that's all for today.
Awesome. Thank you.